and welcome to Paper Pilgrims, a new literary podcast. Travel with us through time as we explore books from around the world. I'm Sneha Nagesh.
And I'm Alex Breeden.
We're continuing to discuss writers from the post-war Japan period. We've already talked about Dazai Osamu and Mishima Yukio. And in this episode, we're going to talk about, Alex, what are we going to talk about?
Our first Nobel Prize winner, Oe Kenzaburo.
In this set of episodes, we're actually talking about Oe's first book, which was Nip the Buds, Shoot the Kids.
Yep, which he wrote at 23 if you need a reason to feel bad about yourself.
And he was already a sort of established writer by that point. So,
although Mishima was established even faster, so I guess we're moving up.
But both Mishima and Oe came from a fairly well-to-do family, I believe.
Oe was born in rural Shikoku, which is one of the four main islands of Japan. And this rural upbringing was really influenced his thinking a lot and his writing and contributed to his becoming a quote-unquote man of the margins. So he's, on the outside and critiquing centers of power and things like that. His father was a bark stripping magnate. So, obviously lots of money, and supplied the raw material for banknote paper. And then he studied French literature at Tokyo University, specializing in Jean-Paul Sartre, but also encountering the writing of Francois Rabelais through his professor. Have you read Rabelais?
I haven't, but I know that the fact that he studied French literature influenced his writing quite a lot.
Yes. I think if you read Rabelais, it'll be really apparent. Rabelais is really fun. I definitely recommend him. He's like 16th century French writer, but he's just like crazy stuff going on. Lots of scatological humor, sexual humor, things like that you might not expect from old French literature. But getting back to Oe, he published stories during his time at university, and then he won the Okugawa Prize, which is Japan's most prestigious literary prize, at the age of 23. So like right before publishing the novel that we're going to be talking about, he was already super established. Following graduation, he worked as a journalist and interviewed such famous personages as Sartre, Mao Zedong, and Kurt Vonnegut. And later, after that, he also began correspondence with Noam Chomsky, which is crazy. Like, clearly, he was in the inside. He knew all of these people, which is
he was cool. I mean, he is cool. He's still alive. And I think the fact that he interviewed all these people, if you read interviews, or if you listen to interviews with Oe, you can kind of see that he knows what he's doing. He knows how to give an interview because I guess he took so many interviews himself. And that's partly the reason why. He's not really like a writer who's kind of lives within his own head. He's always thinking about the listener and what kind of information may be useful to the listener. So.
Yeah. Although he does seem really introverted.
This is true.
So after that, at the age of 28, his wife gave birth to a son, and that son had a cerebral hernia. And they had to have an operation to save the child's life, but that consequently permanently disabled the child. However, Oe named the boy Hikari, which means light, and in a sort of like hopeful, aspirational way. And it turned out well. The boy now he's, grown up, and he's a professional musician, a musical savant. And like if he hears any piece of music once, he can memorize it and repeat it, as I understand it.
You can actually hear his music on YouTube. There's lots of orchestras and things like that he's done, and yeah, they're interesting. And I think the fact that Oe had this child influenced him and his writing in a lot of ways. One of his most famous books is Personal Matter, which is based solely around him and his wife having this child, and also the sort of mental turmoil that he went through before, because I think the Oe and his wife were aware that they were going to have a child with a severe disability before he was born. They kind of had to decide whether they would allow for him to be born or not. And some of his anguish at making this decision is evident in A Personal Matter, and as well as some of his other writing.
Yeah, I mean, almost like half of his work literally is some sort of interpretation on this incident in his life. So it was very influential in impacting his writing.
And his other main influence was, of course, the war, all kinds of wars.
Throughout his life, he's been very involved in political movements. He protested against the French occupation in Algeria, the Vietnam War, and the US-Japan Security Treaty, which is in the 1960s, that was like the largest protest movement that Japan has ever seen. And you can see pictures of it, of Tokyo with the people just filling the streets protesting the security treaty. But more recently, he also wrote an article in protest of nuclear power after the Fukushima nuclear disaster that occurred in 2011.
His protests against war, and we have to remember that he was born in 1935, so just at the start of World War II, and his education was primarily full of war propaganda, as one might imagine. So the fact that Japan lost the war had a deep impact on him, and we'll talk about it later, how this shows through even in his writing in Nip the Buds.
Yeah. I mean, it seems like he felt like people, like all of the adults around him were just lying to him after Japan lost the war.
And he felt sort of cheated. Everything was a lie. I think he'd been taught that if he had to die before the emperor, he would be happily slit his stomach and die in front of him,
right?
As a kid, and then to grow up and kind of discover that there's no real weight in that, or it's a strange thing,
disillusioning
for a child.
But getting back to his literary career, he won the Nobel Prize in 1994. But he rejected the Order of Culture, which is Japan's highest award. It's awarded by the Japanese government. He said, "I do not recognize any authority, any value higher than democracy." And this made a lot of right-wingers really, really angry because, they're obsessed with the emperor and all of that. So in a way, Oe is sort of the anti-Mishima.
But equally polarizing, in a different way.
Although he's not like super left-wing. Like the left wing doesn't really like him that much either, it seems like.
He basically does his own thing. Just experiments a lot in his writing, uses all kinds of, fights against all kinds of authority.
So we both read the Paris Review interview, right?
Yeah. Which
is a really good interview. We would definitely recommend it. I mean, all of the Paris Review interviews are really good. But in this one, he talks about knowing that he was going to be a writer, he would have to self-study a lot. So he set up this program where he would focus on one author for 5 years and then one theme for 3 years, which I thought was really interesting. And it's kind of what we're trying to do in the podcast in a small way, where we're doing a tranche of literature, like post-war Japan.
Yeah, I found that interesting as well, because I think people who like to read, both of us love to read, and you tend to want to read very widely and want to read a lot, but sometimes that kind of takes away from what you might learn from that process. Just a lot of superficial information and not going too deep. So
yeah, need a little discipline. Also in the Paris Review interview, I thought it was funny. He says, "Yeah, I don't really like eating out that much, or I don't really like eating good food. I just eat my wife's food." I'm like, "Ooh, that's a cold burn."
I think his intention was that his wife's food makes him feel comfortable. It's like homely.
I misinterpreted it on purpose.
All right. So let's talk about this book. It's also quite different from the other two books that we read. So to start, should we listen to a reading from the book?
The two of our boys had escaped during the night, so at dawn we still hadn't left. We spent a while hanging out our stiff green coats, wet from the night before in the pale sunshine, and watched the Umber River beyond the fig trees on the far side of the footpath behind the low hedge. Yesterday's violent rain had cracked the path, and clear water was flowing in those sharply edged cracks. Swollen by rain and melted by snow and water from the breached reservoir, the ferociously roaring river was bearing away at tremendous speed the corpses of dogs, cats, and rats.
So that was our reader, Bovu, with the opening passage of Nip the Buds, Shoot the Kids, where Oe establishes the somber mood of the entire novel, and we are introduced to his heavily articulated style. Or if you're reading the translation that we're reading, and we'll have that in the show notes, the translators call this a complex, impacted style, which I think is very accurate.
Yeah, there's a sort of a simple way of saying this, what we just heard. And then there's the Oe way of saying it, which is to add 50 adjectives in every state. Yeah, like a green coat is not just a green coat, it's a stiff green coat.
And I'm a big fan of adjectives, but for some reason I just can't, or always writing just sort of makes my eyes glaze over.
Yeah, you kind of, some of this, like I think even in this first paragraph, when he's introducing the visual impact is high. I get that. And it's good. You know, I like the image of, I mean, I don't like it, but I feel very deeply the image of these dead animals floating in this ferocious river. But then does he need to say it's ferocious and roaring? Because then you just read one of them.
I mean,
right?
yeah, but I mean, arguably that's okay. I mean, because a lot of artists that I think are good and I enjoy, they use redundancy. Like even if you look at Shakespeare or, you know, Tolstoy or someone, they have a lot of redundancy. So I don't think that's necessarily a problem. But there's something about the way that he writes that it feels very clotted and very dense and hard to push through.
It's almost like he wrote the skeleton and then he added details to it.
Well, yeah, that's exactly what he did. Because if you read the opening, again, and this is the opening for the translation that we're reading, his translators say, quote, his usual method is to write a straightforward Japanese sentence, then go over it 2 or 3 times, each time bending it out of its usual shape and making it more refractory, highly worked, and polysemic. And refractory is just, you know, obscure, hard to understand, whatever. And polysemic meaning everything has multiple meanings.
And this I think he had an ambition for Japanese as well. He wanted to retain the musicality of the language, or the tone of the language, and that's why he was one of the reasons.
For Japanese? Because it seems like his writing is really heavily influenced by Western writers, and that he's trying to write in a Western way in Japanese. And he says that too as well.
Does. He actually calls... Well, Japan in the post-war period, occupied by America and then heavily influenced by America, and then continues to be to this day. I think he calls it as a chronic illness, where it's like an Eastern Asian society with deep traditional values and rules, who then is now trying to imitate a very modern culture, and he calls it an illness. But I think it's sort of clear in his own writing too. The narrator, well, actually all the narrator and the characters of this book are interesting because we don't know who they are.
Well, there's really one narrator.
There's one narrator.
Yes, who sometimes uses we.
Right.
Yeah. Which is interesting. I think the collective narration is an interesting touch. But in Japanese, it's really unobtrusive because you're just changing one syllable. Like I, or the I that the narrator is using is boku. And then if you want to say we, it would just be boku ra. So you're just adding ra on the end. It's pretty simple.
Well, it's simple in English as well. With I and we.
Sure. But it's like it's slightly more noticeable, right? Because it's like, in English, it feels like a different subject, but in Japanese, it feels like the same subject, but he's just extending himself a little bit.
Right. So let's talk a bit about the setting of this book, because it's an interesting setting. So, I mean, from the first paragraph, it's sort of clear. We don't really know what's happening.
Yeah, not at all.
There's 2 boys who've just escaped, but we don't know from where. And then there's another group of boys who's being gawked at by some villagers, and there's no proper names actually, even in the beginning of the book, but through the book there's no use of names. We don't know what the village is, where the village is, who these people are.
Yeah, and this sort of gives the whole novel a very like mythical tone to it. It feels it's almost like a fable or something like that, and it's further enhanced by the biblical imagery. There's all this imagery of floods. In chapter 1, he talks about, quote, like a long deluge, the war sent its mass insanity flooding into the convolutions of people's feelings, etc., etc. So again, repetition throughout the book of that flood imagery. Also, do you know what the name is for this sort of opening?
No, I do not.
In media res, I don't know, I don't speak Latin, but it means into the middle of things. And you see it a lot. I mean, famous examples would be the Odyssey or the War and Peace, where you're just dropped right into the action and you don't have all of that exposition. Well,
this book was written 4 years after William Golding's Lord of the Flies. And I think if you read the book, it's very similar.
See, I've never read that.
Yeah.
But I mean, I can, from the cultural things I've absorbed sound similar.
It's like it's a comparison of civilization and savagery, and how even the most civilized can become a savage.
Eventually, we learn that the boys are reformatory inmates being evacuated during the war, and that they're being maltreated by their warden, and really by all the village people who they meet, who are probably just upset because there's no YMCA yet. Anyways, that joke? Okay, moving on. The two boys who have run away at the beginning of chapter 1 return to the group after being attacked by villagers armed with hoes, and OA has the following to say about the boys' situation.
In that time when maddened adults ran riot in the streets, it is enough to record that there was a strange mania for locking up those with skin that was smooth all over, or with just a little glowing chestnut down. Those who had committed petty offenses, including those simply judged to have criminal tendencies.
So OA lays the irony on thick here, because it's kind of highlighting the hypocrisy of strict wartime discipline, was all meted out by adults who are sort of, themselves involved in a collective act of mass murder. But through these initial parts, the adults are always sort of reprimanding these boys, but are often very cruel themselves.
Yeah, which I think is half the point of the novel, at least. I mean, it's in the title there, right? Nip the bud, shoot the kids. They're crushing the children, basically. But I also thought this passage was interesting from a writer's perspective and psychological perspective, because they're talking about projection, where, these adults are doing terrible things, but they don't really want to admit it. And so they're projecting that onto the children and blaming them, or not for their own crimes, but, they're lashing out at them because they themselves are doing something similar. Reminded me reading of Pamela by Samuel Richardson. It has a lot of this very similar psychology where the narrator is like abusing this woman, basically. But, every time he does something really terrible, he just like yells at the woman for doing what he's doing, even though she's completely innocent. Anyways.
Oh, well, that makes sense. I mean, in this book, basically, that's what's happening the whole time.
I also thought that it was really interesting that, OA clearly has an affection for the countryside. He's from rural Japan, but he doesn't idealize the peasants at all. And it's also kind of never really stated why the peasants are so cruel and why they're, such jerks to all the kids in the story.
And OA was living in the countryside, but, as we said, he came from a well-to-do family. So they were sort of on the outskirts of the village. So I think in that way, he was in the countryside, but had a very comfortable life. And then he obviously, from his teenage years, he spent his time in Tokyo, which is a much bigger city and has different kind of luxuries. But I think so, yeah. So that influenced him. But on the other hand, a lot of his early stories, and this is, as we said, it's his first book, were also influenced by his grandma, because his grandma used to tell him all these stories about old folklore tales, and that sort of, this part may not necessarily be based on his own village, but from some of the stories he heard from his grandma.
Right. I do think, though, that is one thing that's missing in this book is an analysis of why these villagers are so cruel, because that's really the crucial issue, right? Is like, why is this entire country insane? That, to me, that's what the crucial issue is.
Well, and because it's about the book is about war, right? It's about what war makes people do, and OA was coming from that space. So yes, that is a crucial point. It's not. I think he's left it to the reader.
Yeah, it's the novel is descriptive rather than analytical.
So, but the narrator is not. So, so it's a group of boys, but then we're also introduced to his brother, who is, who's really different from all the other boys. He's very bright and sort of the epitome of innocence. He's hopeful. This was, I don't know what the brother was doing there, because it's supposed to be a reformatory group, but how did he get there?
Right, well, because his father wanted to evacuate him, but couldn't find any better way to evacuate him than throwing him in with all the other reformatory kids who were being evacuated.
Right, so their own parents are also terrible people.
Yeah, but that also just further characterizes this the brother, because the brother is not entirely like the reformatory boys, so he's transgressive. He's a transgressive character. He crosses all these bounds. He's supposed to be someone who unifies different elements, which is why commentators call him hermaphroditic, which I don't really understand, because hermaphroditic means that you have both male and female sexual organs. But they're just using it, I think, in this terms of he's unifying opposites. But I don't know why they chose that particular word.
He always calls that, because he wrote after Nib the Badshu the Kids. Later on, he wrote another book, which kind of analyzed his own book, because he was a very self-conscious writer.
Right.
And
yeah, very pomo.
yeah. And and I think in that book, he refers to this character as hermaphroditic as well. Because
that would make sense.
As you said, it's sort of opposite ends. The narrator is sort of, he's sort of a neutral person, really. He's not really showing his true side most of the times. But on the other hand, the brother is always representing good for a certain period, but then he also gets influenced by the external world and starts to, I think he even tries to make up a crime for himself so that he can fit in with this group of reformatory boys. So that's sort of where this pull in both directions, good and bad. And this pair of brothers is a recurring motif through most of Owe's books.
Yeah, I feel like most of Owe's catalog is really repetitive, at least from what I've read.
If he's not writing repeating things, then he's just analyzing his own work and writing about that.
This must be someone's cup of tea. Actually, it was my professor's cup of tea. She was one of the articles that I have listed on here is my college professor.
Even from his reading style, he likes to go deep. He wants to improve on, fine-tune something till it's perfect. That's his style.
Yeah, but so is Gustave Flaubert, but that's a very different perfectionism.
Right. Different things, same things.
Different things.
So getting back to the plot of and what's happening in the book. So they're sort of evacuating this group of boys. And then they come across a group of army cadets. And then this is when we discover that one of these army people has escaped into the woods. And this becomes a very important character, which we find out later on. But the boys, so the group of boys, they reach the village by crossing a deep flooded valley in a trolley, and then they end up locked in a temple overnight. And the readers then, we come to know that they aren't fed very well. They just get a meal of potatoes, and they don't have anything to drink. It's a terrible life.
Right. It seems horrible that people are treating children this way. But also you have the imagery of the children being locked up in the temple, which represents, in my eyes, the decay of tradition and how insufficient that is for protecting children or creating a decent life or anything like that.
Yeah, they're not treated like children, worse than animals.
It's pretty horrendous. I mean, Japan during World War II did some messed up stuff. I think they were really terrible to their prisoners of war as well.
Can't imagine the cruelty towards animals because, during the war. And through this book, there's lots of dead animals that keep appearing. These children encounter these animals as well. Some they encounter a dead dog and a dead cat lying in the middle of the road. And then there's lots of cruelty shown using these animals as sort of as a tool, because one of the villagers makes the kids drag these animals along with them. They have to go and then put these dead animals in a heap of other decaying dead animals. So it's a strange thing for an adult to be making a child do.
And as we'll soon find out, it's even worse how little the adults care about the children's health. But as the boys look on this pile of decaying animal carcasses that they've heaped up, the blacksmith, who's the one instructing them at the time, the villager who's instructing them, he yells at them and says,
"Dig a hole and bury them," said the blacksmith. "Don't stand around gawping. Work." but we only stood there vacantly, in a stench which we could smell from the skin of our faces. Never mind our nostrils, like a thick liquid gushing out from the mass of beasts. The stink which gushed out, twisting and twining, was impregnated with something that tantalized us. Children who have sniffed eagerly with their small noses pressed against the hindquarters of a bitch in heat. Children who have the courage and reckless desire to enjoy even for a short while the dangerous pleasure of rapidly stroking the back of an aroused dog, can recognize the subtle human signal and allure in the stink of animal carcasses. We opened our eyes wide, fit to burst, and inhaled lustily.
Yeah, this is the weird stuff in the novel, which, I mean, there's some instances before this passage, but this was really sticks out. I mean, from the very first paragraph, or not the first paragraph, but chapter 1, early on, we have the boys, quote, flaunting their immature penises like reddish apricots at the villagers. And then there's an American airman who's flying by, and he sticks his butt in the fuselage of a strafing plane. So there's all kind of weird sexuality and scatology going on in this book.
Oh, I love this.
Clearly.
I think he's written, I don't know which book exactly, he's written some books where he's just talked in sexual language. And it was it's always like a cover for something else. He's talking about something else, but then he's using sexuality to talk about it. But he does this a lot. But because the last book we read, The Temple of the Golden Pavilion, there was also lots of, Mishima loves the use of sexuality as well. And then he was using it in a more traditional way because, sexuality was used to approach beauty, and in a way it makes sense, but Oe kind of uses it for the opposite.
Yeah, I mean, Oe is really accepting of the sexuality, whereas Mishima feels very puritanical about it, and Oe was talking about Shiga Naoya's work. So Shiga Naoya, one of the major Japanese writers, he was the apogee of the I novel in Japan. And he has this one novel where at the end of it, the narrator is about to have some bout of diarrhea, but he takes herbal medicine so that he won't have diarrhea, basically to constipate him, I guess. And then he goes up into the mountain and he has this romantic fusion with nature, and he loses himself, and there's a transcendental experience. But always the way he should have written it was he shouldn't have taken medicine. He should have gone up into the mountains and defecated everywhere.
Good old Oe.
Yes.
I mean, even in this, that's his style.
Clearly.
Well, and it's also some teenagers, the kids and teenagers are curious about the world, they're curious about sex, and it's a good point to make. But using so many sexual references to make that point seems unnecessary.
Yeah, I just feel like it rubs me the wrong way because of OA combines it with the traditional realist writing, that's sober realist writing, combined with the sexual humor is jarring in some way to me. I really like Rabelais and that sort of sexual humor, but this is something about it I can't.
Yeah, it feels laid on.
But getting back to the plot line for a bit, the boys get to work burying all these animals that are piled up, and later it becomes clear that all of the animals have died of a plague, or what is believed to be a plague, and the villagers are using them, the kids that is, to avoid being contaminated themselves, which is even more horrific as adult behavior. It's
very similar to a condition we find ourselves in at this present moment in time, in 2020.
What would that be? Pan-fried?
Right, exactly, that one.
Pan-seared? Okay.
But yeah, I think, Corona times, reading this book is particularly fascinating because it shows human behavior in times of strife and how it changes, especially human adult behavior.
Yeah, I didn't think about it too much, but it would be interesting to compare behavior in this book to how people are acting right now.
Well, I don't know if the boys, none of them are showing any symptoms of this weird sickness. So it's, using these boys who no one cares about as a sort of medium to protect themselves.
Right. I'm sure that's happening somewhere right now.
Essential services.
Oh, essential services.
People who have to provide essential services, and then there's other people who can stay at home.
Hopefully they're not children, though.
Hopefully they're not children. Or teenagers.
But that's true, yeah. No, you're right. I mean, like people working at Amazon, that's the same thing, right? Where you have these people who are being forced to keep working to provide stuff for all the rest of us, even though they don't necessarily want to be essential workers, but they're stuck in it.
But after this part, the book gets even more grotesque and ominous. There's something hanging in the air. There's this disease, and up until then you think it's just going to be it's about the war or something like that. But there's also this strange illness, and it makes the characters all behave in varying different ways.
Yeah, I think the book gets more interesting from here.
So I think we made some decent progress now. So we'll call this episode to a close. In the next episode, we'll continue our discussion of Nip the Butts, Shoot the Kids.
And you can find us on Patreon as well if you'd like to support us. And you can access our extended show notes and become a contributor.
Yeah. And we're also on, we post visual content on SNS, so find us there. And if you're listening, let us know you are. We'd love to hear from you. Thank you so much for listening, and watch the space for the next episode.